So tonight, we have a great panel of experts. And with that, I wanted to invite Liz Gasser. Liz used to be VP of Strategy. VP of Strategy at Qualcomm, and now is Managing Partner at Highcamp Ventures. Also wanted to invite David Knight, the CEO of Turbine. And Maxim Pecharski, Chief Data Officer of the City of San Diego. Welcome, Maxim. So how did we get to the topic of city as operating system? So I had a couple of discussions in the past with different people at the city, and the topic came up, and then it was actually, all credit goes to Maxim, because Maxim suggested, why don't you do an event where we can start talking about the city as an operating system, and what is a city as an operating system? A couple of weeks ago, when I was in the Bay Area at the IoT World, and was talking to Jonathan Reichenthal from the city of Palo Alto, and I mentioned that I was doing this event. He said, "Oh, is this based on the book?" And I said, "Which book?" He said, "Oh, there's a book that just came out that's called New City OS." I immediately went on my Kindle, I downloaded the book, I started reading it, and I just finished it. And I highly recommend to anybody who is interested in city as operating system to go and read this book. It's called New City OS by Stephen Goldsmith, right? Yeah, Stephen Goldsmith from Harvard Kennedy School. It really puts a lot of things in perspective. But our event is not based on this book. Our event is more about to steer the discussion around how you can imagine running a city as an operating system. So I wanted to start tonight's discussion by giving you guys opportunity to introduce yourself and talk a little bit of what is city operating system for you. What is your vision? Let's start with you, Maxim.
Cool. Thanks, Daniel. So my name is Maxim. I'm the Chief Data Officer for the City of San Diego. And we have 36 different departments. They all effectively act as separate organizations that have to work with one another. There's a lot of different systems that have to talk to each other. And for me, a city operating system is a way for these departments to systematically interact with one another. So an example that I was just giving Daniel earlier today is Amazon Web Services, right? Amazon Web Services is a byproduct of a management directive issued by Jeff Bezos back in, I think it was 2000. And the directive was, hey, you guys are not going to have any meetings. You're not going to have, you're not going to have coordination. You're going to provide a standard interface for your team and what your team does, and that is how you're going to, and it's going to be documented, and that's how you're going to interact with one another. And for me, a pie-in-the-sky vision of a city operating system is granular city operations that are modular and predictable. So if I need a permit, I can send information that lets me get a permit, and I get a permit response back, right? And before I do that, I can send information asking what information do I need to submit a permit, and then I get a response back. So to me, that's one level of a city operating system. Another level that's, I think, a little bit more achievable, a little bit less pie in the sky, is a way for all city information systems to communicate using one standard set of protocols. So a good example that we can use is HTTP. HTTP is a standard that the entire internet works on. Everybody on the internet is different, but by conforming to this one standard agreed on protocol, these various systems in various languages with various use cases communicate with one another. And in effect, HTTP is the operating system of the web. And when I think of a city operating system, a common set of standard protocols that underlies the technology and the data systems under the city, to me, that's what a smart city or a city operating system is.
Awesome. David, please.
Sure. Hi. So I'm just making sure I didn't wear the same shirt I was taking that picture in. How about you? Yeah. So I will explain briefly what Turbine is, since we're not launching the company until next week. But the purpose of Turbine is to create a fairly large-scale system that can take in machine-generated data, and by that we mean colloquially that's called the Internet of Things. So we're talking about everything that could possibly generate data that's not a person, although it could have to do with a person. And we're focusing a lot on things like cars and the data they throw off, and smart light poles and ships and all sorts of interesting things that are now generating an abundance of data. So the problem, which relates exactly to the city operating system and part of what Maxim's talking about, is that this data is not really discoverable right now. If you've ever seen data that comes from sensors, it's just a string of usually digits that might say lat long timestamp value, and you have no idea what that is, what unit of measurement is involved, what generated it, who owns the device generating it. Is that owner also the person or company or government agency that can convey a license to it? And so all of those issues and the GDPR, because I know your inboxes have been as full as mine have with new terms of use from everybody in the universe, that even affects this type of data when it crosses from Europe into other countries. So Turbine attempts to wrangle all of that, create a very thick control layer, and it describes everything so fully that it can be indexed and then searched by humans or machines, even AIs. And we're now, we're announcing next week, sneak preview, we're announcing that a lot of cities, states around the country and people like big car companies are going to be able to use this system we've just created for free for 6 months so that everybody can get used to a curated way to exchange their machine-generated data. There we go.
Oh, how to follow those two. Hi, my name's Liz, as Daniel said. By way of introduction, I generally think of myself as a career strategist with accidental forays into corporate development M&A. Bit louder, okay, better? Perfect, all right, cool. I've spent the past 18 years in the mobile industry, initially with a company called OpenWave, who was the company behind the original mobile browsers, originally known as phone.com. Spent the past 11 years at Qualcomm, working primarily on the portfolio side of the house, so on all of the businesses that weren't chips, which spanned IoT, wearable technology, tracking technology, context marketing, healthcare, you name it. So I feel like I've been in and around kind of mobile apps and software for a good while. I'm now independent, working with early stage growth companies on where they go next with their portfolios. But as I thought about the topic for this evening, I thought long and hard about where mobile has effectively come from, because operating systems have been a massive source of debate for our industry for a long time now. And it almost feels like a character in a Star Wars film. Where were you during the mobile wars? And I looked back at my notes earlier today, and during the period 94 to 2011, we went through 34 OS-type platforms that were aspiring to be the platform that want to rule them all. And if you think about it, ultimately that all consolidates and you end up with one. But the problem with those kind of operating systems as standards is they're all effectively de facto. One company came out on top and now gets to control what sits on top of the operating system. And as I tried to parlay that topic into the smart city domain, I found the prospect quite horrifying. The idea that at a city scale that we could be looking at platforms to rule them all and exist as a common layer that controls everything else. And so
A certain company in Mountain View.
There are many companies who aspire to this, and one thing I have learned is with every turnover in the domain, it's not the same company, right? It's always someone else who comes in. But it causes the comments that my co-panelists made around data to, I think, really come to the fore, which is to pose the question that once you cut through the mess of trying to interface devices to a back-end system, at the end of the day, this is really about, can you get common data interoperability? And maybe the answer isn't an OS, maybe the answer is multiple OSs for multiple use cases, but with a very strong perspective on what the city itself needs in terms of usable data, which I think is a lot of what Turbine is working on.
Excellent. Thanks, Liz. So my next question is to David. So considering what's been said about interoperability, and you mentioned that you've been looking and basically your system is integrating machine data, machine-generated data. But when we look at the city, it's not just machine data, right? It's all different kinds of data. So you have structured data, unstructured data, you have financial data, you have permits data, and so on and so on. So how do you think, what would be the right approach, or what would be the technical approach to something like that and integrating all these different types of data?
Well, that's a really interesting question because just by concentrating on machine-generated data, so we started this journey a while ago. I said we've been effectively in stealth mode. The first thing we found out, it's sort of like your version of the mobile OS wars. There are, and I'm not exaggerating, millions of formats. And if you take all the sensor types in the world and all the manufacturers and all the versions from one manufacturer of, the blank manufacturer, barometric pressure sensor 201B version 1.59 small b, So we had to make a really strategic decision. We talked to a lot of people and got advice, and we said, we're not going to dictate a common format for the entire Internet of Things. It would be either some giant canonical thing that was, 1 million characters long, or you have to do the opposite, which is to attempt to normalize. Normalizing data is sort of a form of compression, and the problem with IoT data, and I think it's really worth mentioning, the difference between IoT data, like the things you find normally around the city, this is the data that can cause very tragic consequences if it's interpreted wrong. You could accidentally turn all the lights in the city green simultaneously because some bad data got into the system. And we decided instead of trying to mess with the data, there's also liability issues there you have to worry about in conveying that to a third party. Just do all the work in the control layer, and we got our idea from the telephony world. So all phone calls in the world are governed by a common construct, the original version called Signaling System 7 for all the phone people out there. And that was what happened in the way from analog to digital telephony. What happened at the same time, and I think it bears very much on this concept of a city operating system, is that we went from the analog telephony infrastructure in the United States and most countries, but going analog to digital wasn't the only thing that happened. There was a regulatory thing that happened. They deregulated the phone system. We used to have one phone system, and now we have thousands of phone systems, and they tend to be aggregated under the big names we know, but there are still thousands of phone companies around the United States and the world. So they had to have a common way, a lingua franca, if you will, that says, when I convey the call to you and you're the Pakistani phone company, you know what I'm doing, I'm handing it off to you. This all happens in fractions of a second. And then there's all the boring stuff, the tariffing, the conveyance of the billing. Pakistan wants money to pass the call on from the United States and that sort of thing. So we realized we were actually attempting to do that for the machine-generated data. So now I'll answer your question. There's no reason you couldn't apply that kind of a thing to any kind of data, which is really the point. We learned that in telephony and container shipping and air traffic control and those big systems, they don't go all the way in and say, this plane can only be used to carry marbles to Africa, right? It's like, they don't care. But the system knows all about that plane, but it's not dictating the contents. In the same way, container shipping doesn't dictate what goes in the containers, but it does standardize the format and how they're conveyed physically. And telephony doesn't say I can only use my phone to call you about lunch. I can call you about anything I want. So that abstraction layer where you do the control and the identification, the discovery, and things like licensing, billing, by keeping it separate from the data layer, it means you could have any kind of data you want. The other thing I want to mention, we've learned, and it's also true in things like telephony and container shipping and air traffic control, is that it's really a triad. There's not just the technological issues, there's also these business issues, and there's the legal issues that could include licensing, regulatory and compliance. One more second on this. I think I was sort of half joking about everybody getting these memos about the new terms and conditions that have been triggered by the GDPR onset. And I think that woke up a lot of people, especially in the States, to say, oh, Europe is going to set up different rules about this that we have to literally pay attention to, or big companies will get fined by the European Union. And that is probably the first big evidence of compliance and regulatory issues coming into play for data movement. It really hasn't happened here yet, but there's lots of murmurings about that. And I think those things have to get standardized for all of this to come together. And as you pointed out in our earlier discussion, the one we're referring to, it's not just technology, it's also got to be how people interact with the systems and each other.
Excellent. Thanks, David. Maxim, what do you think about what's your city's view and your view on how do you integrate different types of data?
That's a good question. So for us, the way that we have a lot of legacy systems. We are an organization that's been around for 150 years, and we have a variety of different systems, everything from old school Oracle databases to mainframes to SQL servers to newer stuff like the City IQ Lights that we have going on that have nice, clean, RESTful APIs. And we've run into a lot of the same challenges that you mentioned. One, we need to integrate it. How do I get a cross-sectional view, and how do I get an answer to a question? But we also have to understand it, right? And we have to say that this is what this column means, and this is what that column means, and here are all the caveats in the collection and the creation and the curation of that column. And so in our case, what we look into is we do a lot of integration across multiple data sources with a use case in mind. So bringing in data from different data systems, trying to solve a problem. And at the same time, we also run a data catalog system, which allows us to work with people across the city to mark up what the data actually means. So here's what this column means, here's what that column means in this specific database and that specific database, so that when the next person comes by and tries to use it and tries to understand it, well, here are all the caveats that you can read and understand. And so it's kind of creating this walkthrough between pulling the data together and at the same time making sure that it's available and that it's understood, and also more importantly that it's discoverable. We're a big organization, and so I'm probably one of the few people in the city that has the largest view of what data we have as a city, and there's not a lot of people that have that same view. And how do I make sure that those people are able to discover what data that we have available before they go buy another system to collect the same data that we already collect? And that's kind of how we look at it: discoverability, documentation, and integration across all the sources that we have.
And just to follow up on this, like going forward, right? Okay, so you have a legacy system that you need to work and normalize. But going forward, is there a way for you to encourage all the new data that's being generated in departments to basically make sure that it's readable with different other departments, that it's consistent, and so on?
Are there ways? Yes and no. So there's always going to be legacy systems, right? In any organization you have, 20 years from now, the MySQL that you're using right now is going to be a legacy system. There's always going to be that churn of data and that lag of replacement systems and all that. There's always going to be human error. We're never going to get to, well, I don't want to say never, but I don't think within our lifetime we're going to get to a situation where human is not entering data into a machine in some way or another, right? And so what we have to do as we're developing new systems is we have to try and put controls in place to make sure that the data that the data being entered has the least amount of error rates. But I think the solution to that is not going out and buying IoT, right? At the end of the day, I think we really have to, sometimes it is going out and buying IoT, don't get me wrong. But I think what we really have to keep in mind as we work on data systems and IT systems and technology systems is the problem we're trying to solve, the thing we're trying to fix, the goal that we want to accomplish, and what system gets us to that point, rather than, and with the minimal amount of trade-offs, right? There's always going to be trade-offs. And there's always going to be that balance. I don't think that balance is ever going to go away.
Thanks, Maxim. Next question to you, Liz. And I wanted actually to build on both things, on your experience as working for technology companies, but also as an investor working with and advising a lot of startup companies. Like as a private company, as a startup, at least what investors very often ask is like, what's your lock-in, right? How do you make sure that nobody else can compete with you successfully? And how do you build all those hooks into a business model or into a technology that you just kind of control, or, you know, for lack of a better word, you more successful in a particular area? How can this be balanced with the idea of openness if you're approaching the city's operating system and working with others and so on? What do you think would be the right approach?
That's a knotty question. I think you're right. I do a decent amount of work with private equity and venture, and certainly a recurring theme right now is effectively monthly recurring revenue, right? How do you get that annuity, if you will, that's worth my investing in? Because they really don't like the hardware side of things. That's one and done, and it doesn't scale. And so even last week, I was judging some vision-based pitches up in the Bay Area, and the vision hardware companies out making cameras were on stage saying, you know, I'm not selling hardware, I'm selling a service. You know, I might even give my cameras away. And at a certain point, you start penciling the math and going, well, that's just silly. You won't do that. But it is a fixation right now. And so what I think ultimately needs to happen is, you know, every company will try to create its unique value. And in many ways, as you say, people try to lock in data. Problem, I think, with data and platforms is I tend to think of them as like, you know, the balloons you make balloon animals with. You squeeze them up one end, and they pop out at the other end. And so no matter how open somebody says their platform is, Google's awesome at this, right? You know, we're an open platform. We're all about openness. Yeah, except for the back-end data that you keep under lock and key. So that's where you went and held the balloon. So I think the key is when you think about having this discussion with City, for me, yes, you have to find a way to give that startup value. You have to find a way to help them get participation in the recurring portions of this value chain, including performing functions on data, potentially giving certain rights to data. But if I were advising a startup company, I would really encourage them to, in tandem with that, go hard at this idea of building handoffs and interoperability and touch points. Because we're so early with this that value will be created today by the rising tide. That's how you go from 30 operating systems in mobile, ultimately to a few. But along the way, people built, solved problems, experimented, created value before, as an industry, we were confronted with that prospect. And so, yes, I think there's a two-way discussion to be had here. The cities need to understand that this is how these companies will get invested in. There has to be some level of give in terms of rights. But I think the startups also need to appreciate that if your play is lock-in, at the end of the day, you won't last very long. You will secure a few cities who are happy to go along with your proposition as is, and then you will hit a brick wall where you have to interface with a third-party system and you're not useful to the city. And so it's a real balancing act, and I think it requires a certain amount of visionary interaction with one's ecosystem and competition. Did
Super.
I answer your question?
No, that's perfect. Thanks. I wanted to ask all of you guys a question, and since we've been at legacy systems versus new systems, do you guys think it's even thinkable that somebody may dominate this space? And we have companies like SAP, Oracle, we have Google, we have Microsoft, and so on. Is it like thinkable that somebody will end up dominating the space of city operating system? Or do you think it's always going to be some kind of a mishmash combination and more equally distributed?
Since I'm holding the mic, I'll just offer my 2 cents on that. My initial response is no. I think that the types of systems that we have seen today on the tech side, where people arise to a point of dominance have been around what I would call fairly narrow propositions. I mean, phones are very, very useful, convey a lot of content, but they're also limited function devices. Similarly, PCs, yes, enabling platform, but it's one device type, class, category. And they both have shorter lifespans. And so you see these turnovers in the asset base, which enable people to very quickly arise to that point of control. My hypothesis on the city side, I mean, is if we're really dealing with 5, 10, 20, and 30-year asset lives, we're dealing consistently with a brownfield environment. I struggle at a pure software level with the idea of a single company becoming dominant. I do think there may be a window for proactive standards body work. And people hate standards bodies because they move slowly. Everyone's got a vested interest. But I don't see on the city side a way around putting in the hard legwork to get to, as you say, David, lingua franca, right?
I mean, I'm just sitting here and thinking, and I think my initial answer would be no, right? But then again, it really depends how you define an operating system. So going back to what I was saying earlier, if you define an operating system as a way to share data across an organization, that may not be that far out of reach, right? And let's take a conceptual exercise. What does a company have to do to be able to enter into that space and be able to take over? I think I don't think that company exists today. I think that company has to be very, very good at deep integrated user research. I really do. 99.9% of the companies that come and pitch us have no idea what problems we face. They have no idea of the workflows that we have. They have no idea how cities work. And a company that has even the slightest hope of coming in and standing in as even a base level data sharing operating system for a city has to have very deep, very intimate knowledge of that. So if that company were to ever exist, my answer would probably be maybe. But from what I know about the market today, I don't know if that's possible.
That's an awesome answer.
I
David.
think that company will exist in the future. It'll be called Apple, Amma, Google, Lama Lama Ding Dong. I don't know. It'll be all those companies in one mega thing. Yeah, I think if we look at it in terms of layers, there probably will be companies that kind of own the different layers, just like we saw emerge in the mobile ecosystem. But one thing both of you are touching on is really important is the ecosystem idea itself, that people with domain expertise need to be able to interact, say, interoperate at the data level as well with other actors that know about different parts of it. And the other thing, we're kind of in this quasi-homogeneous environment of the United States, but if you go to cities in other parts of the world, there's a lot of things that are the same, and boy, there are a lot of things that are very, very different. And I'm not talking about the GDPR. But so it would be hard to imagine a player of the city operating system per se. But I also think it's a good maybe pivot to say that it seems like we might see some regulatory things show up. At what level, federal, states, counties, cities, et cetera. But there may be standards that are de jure, not just de facto, that could emerge. And that theme that we've circled back on, that it also involves, humans and what do they do and what are their jobs and what's important, both individually and their actual departments in a city that are probably pretty siloed because they have different budgets. And so they're not necessarily intended to share in the first place by the way their fiscal structures are created.
Awesome. Guys, I have a whole bunch of questions I want to ask, but I want to give opportunity to the audience to ask some questions that they wanted to ask coming here. So anybody wants to ask anything, the panelists? Perfect.
So it's kind of a question for Max. So, why don't you quit and do it if you know what to do?
It's hard. It's really, really hard, and you would have to create a system that's flexible enough to accommodate the different ways that different cities operate, right? Again, I don't think it's in the impossible space. I think it's just really, really hard, and maybe I will.
This is a question to Max too. So when it comes to the, let's say, the democracy of the data, like how transparent do you think, like even with like whatever implemented legislations would this data be? Like would it be access for like nonprofit or like for profit? Is it like a sort of like a paid API? Because like nowadays you go walk into the city if you want to get a hard copy of like whatever, like a DUI data or like crimes data, it would be some sort of a complicated process with like a political type of interaction. How easy would it be like for open data, let's say?
So very hard. That's my job. So what we do is we run data.sandiego.gov, which actually kind of works to solve that problem, right? So as a resident, you pay taxes. You are entitled to getting access to city data, right? That's part of the Freedom of Information Access Law, locally called the Public Records Act law, right? There's a lot of data that gets requested over and over again. You just gave some examples of it, right? Permit data, crime data, things like that. So what we do is we work, so let's take permit data, right? Huge database, hundreds of tables, right? And if you've ever, I'm sure most of you in this room have worked with a relational database, you have to understand what query to write, right? And that's kind of how we got into that whole topic of documenting and discovery and all that. We figure out what query to write, and we push it out through an automated process to data.sandiego.gov so that you can grab it and you can use it and you can do whatever you want with it. We don't care. It's under an open license. Multiply that by hundreds and hundreds of different data sources of different types, of different ages, of different collection methods, and it becomes really hard. But I mean, that's one of the services, one of the core services that the city offers you as a resident.
So a quick follow-up question. So about the ownership of the data, like can I like take the entire city of San Diego data set and train my models with, and would it become like
So that was also very hard, but our data is released under the public domain dedication license. And so basically what that means is you can go, you can get it, you can download it, you can do whatever you want with it, except you can't see the city. And that is your right, that is the public domain dedication license.
Also, at the federal level, generally speaking, unless it's some DoD thing that you're not supposed to have, anything that's represented as open data, they're generally not allowed to do anything but offer it as open data. For example, everything from NASA, is public domain, but Department of Agriculture, you name it. But if you do a derivative work from it, then you're allowed to make money from it. And that's why people like Bloomberg can take thousands of public data sources and charge a lot of money for access, because the act of indexing them and sort of codifying and making them discoverable, that's called value add.
So what problem that citizens actually have does smart cities solve?
Good question. Awesome question. I will fire a question right back at you as to what you define smart cities to be. Right?
I can't hear you.
Better? Better? So my counter question to that is, what do you define smart cities to be, right? Because there is no standard definition of what smart cities is. It could be our sensors, but it could be good use of
Okay, because I attended the hackathon and learned all about the APIs and heard several presentations about exactly what smart cities was supposed to be. And it seems to be a platform for companies to write apps and make money. That's great, but this is a city, not a product line or an OS or anything like that. Those are very, very different things. And it's very inspiring to hear a city is an OS, but that's a whole essay that needs to be written. So what problem do citizens actually have that you guys are solving, that you're here to present and advocate for and prove and show? Speak to the core problems that people have that this will solve.
So one of the things that we have always looked at with one of our City IQ deployments is trying to understand how people move around the city without being creepy about understanding how people move around the city. So how do pedestrians flow and how do cars flow across different streets and across and at what speeds and what times of day, things like that. So why do we care? Because we need to understand where our parking meters are. We need to understand if our parking meters should be there. We need to understand if they're making money. We need to understand space utilization. We need to understand whether we should build, with our limited resources, whether we should build a bike lane here or we should build a bike lane there. Are we there doing that analysis right now, today, making those decisions? No, we're not. We're getting there, and it's hard because the data streams that we have coming at us are big, and the city's not equipped to handle that. We're not used to working with this type of data. And we are getting there. And a lot of the reason that you see these hackathons that are backed by our economic development departments or backed by organizations that are in the community is because it's a space that we're continuously exploring, right? And I know this sounds a little cheesy and aspirational, but I think in a way we have to do that. We have to try to understand what are the things we don't know and work with the community to do that, because how else would we get there, right? Creating that context between cities and the community and the companies, that, I mean, that's a whole philosophy. Like you said, it's an essay. Is it the job of a city to do that? That's a whole conversation that we can have. But that is effectively what we're doing right now. We're exploring the space. Do we have concrete use cases that we're planning to do? Yes, absolutely. Could we have more, and could they be better? And do we see a path to more things? Absolutely as well. We just haven't found what they are yet.
Guys, do you want to comment on this?
Just at some level, I bifurcate this into two layers, and one's externally facing, one's internally facing. So maybe to use an example that's not an American one, there's a collaboration in the UK right now called One Transport, and it's a public-private engagement. It does involve a company called Interdigital, who is providing a lot of the platform pieces, but it's also an engagement with the various counties who are providing traffic and traffic data into the system. With it, they are doing things like proactive deployment of emergency services, police, and traffic management in conjunction with major events like, racing events at Silverstone Racetrack. That is purely IoT. That required APIs across multiple city systems, and it is of direct benefit both to the population, who gets better traffic flow on event days, but then also city services, who can deploy their assets more effectively. And so I think that is there are clearly people making money out of this. That's why they're doing it. That's why the private companies are at the table. But I'm not sure that the county entities who are participating would necessarily have been able to do that without the participation. So that's kind of one layer, the internal city efficiency piece. The other layer, I think, really gets to the crux of, I think, some of what you're touching on around kind of the developer ecosystem-like pieces of this, where there's a lot of talk about APIs, there's a lot of talk about app ecosystems, there's a lot of talk about essentially internet-like companies coming in, using this data, making lots of money off the people who live in the city. It's a more problematic space, although even there, I think, to your point, Maxim, we're in a position where this data exists. The city has an obligation to be respectful of the citizens' privacy, but by the same token, we can't imagine today all of the things that would be useful. And so, for example, parking data, empty spots, full spots. For Audi, for example, today, to provide real-time information through its interface in the car about what's available for parking, you actually need to pull city data, and you need a third-party private entity to go form relationships with all the private garages to figure out what level of occupancy they have. Again, I don't see how some of that gets done without a profit motive, and a bridging of the private-public enterprise pieces. It raises huge privacy questions. And as I said earlier in my opening comments, the idea of tech companies controlling this notional OS, having worked in tech companies for 20 years, scares the bejesus out of me because it gets down to economic control. And when you have single entities making decisions, they don't always optimize against all variables. Right? Was that helpful?
So something you touched on, we've looked at hundreds and hundreds of use cases for data generated by municipalities, counties. It really runs the gamut. One thing I'll mention, you're talking about things like Silverstone Raceway and so on. There's some really interesting things you can do once you have enough. And if you look at any technology adoption, when you get to these critical mass points, like, so here's an interesting example. If I were to ask most people, what did you need to exist for Uber to work? Why didn't we have it 10 years ago? First of all, we needed smartphones that had the cool screen and everything. 2, the smartphones had to have a GPS chip in them, and there's some other ways they do location. And that was good GPS. It had to be part of the phone. For a short time, it was actually an add-on or an option. But the other things people don't really talk about is you had to have great mobile coverage that tended to be pervasive throughout a city. And then the one that almost nobody ever talks about, data had to be free, essentially free, because there was quite a period of time where you could pay by the kilobyte and eventually the megabyte to use data on your mobile device. So if you took all that out of the equation, you can do Uber. And some of the other really cool things we've been seeing, for example, a while back there was an earthquake in Napa Valley, and it was not a huge earthquake, but it took place at 3 o'clock in the morning. And why that's salient is that meant that most people were not, at work or at the mall or in their car commuting. They were probably at home, maybe asleep. And so what happened is Fitbit, the next day, their data scientists looked at the Fitbit readings from thousands of people throughout the Bay Area. And it was astonishing, and you can look this up, that the correlation of the rise time of your heartbeat when we were violently woken up by the earthquake mapped very cleanly to the USGS seismograph plot. It's amazing, and it's happened a couple times now. And so, you didn't get the Fitbit to be a seismograph, but for 1 minute in time you were. And there's going to be a lot of cool stuff like that once you can get this data out there. Another one that's not here quite yet, some of these new vehicles, they're going to have autonomous features, have radars and LiDAR, which is laser radar, that creates this incredibly absolute map of what's around the vehicle. Well, it can't help but see what's over there slightly up in the sky because of what's called the intake swath of the laser radar. So it turns out that it actually knows about things like trees, catenary wires for electric trams. It knows there's a construction crane that wasn't there yesterday. And the car doesn't use that for navigation, but if the city can get access to it, you might use that to navigate a delivery drone flying down the street. And then the delivery drone company can pay the city for the data. So, but you need all that stuff to show up. And I think just like when the first, the iPhone, when he held it up on the stage, it was a really cool phone, but it took a while to get the app ecosystem. You had to have enough of them for people to want to write the apps, usually with a profit motive. So again, these are about hitting these critical mass points.
Awesome. I think we should start giving out prizes for best questions because that was definitely a candidate. How are we doing on time? We have time for a few more questions. Guys, I can't believe you don't have questions. You do?
Oh,
yes.
Is this working? Okay. Yeah, so this is sort of for Maxim, but I'd like everyone's perspective on this. You had mentioned that really a deep workflow research into how a city operates is really critical, like you said, if you have any chance of implementing something at a municipal level. So I guess my specific question is, if you're in an idea stage as a startup or trying to make a technology really work, how do you go about fitting that technology, looking at, how do you make that technology compatible with the workflow? What steps would you have to go through to sort of find a convergence of those two things, I guess?
Besides getting a job at the city? We're not hiring, not yet. Here's what I would say. I mean, it's a big question, right? But it's the same answer that I would have for you if you were doing a startup related to a bank, or an oil company, or another kind of typically closed institution, right? Except the city acts like that, but it doesn't have to be, right? So the reason a bank is closed is because it has a bunch of IP and private information, something for an oil company, something for an organization like, GE, whatever. A city doesn't have to be, and it's tricky, right? Because you have to find the right people, and you have to find the right angle to do that kind of user research. But it's not impossible, and it's your typical, it's your typical design thinking stuff. And I'm totally going to call out Chris in the audience because she does a lot of those workshops, and they're great. But it's finding those venues like this one, like Chris's, where you can go and you can understand and you can meet city people that do the stuff day in and day out. I'm not talking about people like me. I'm talking about people like, you want to do something in firefighting, like go meet a firefighter, right? Part of a firefighter's or cop's job description is to go talk to the residents, right? Start there. I think that's a part that we continuously miss. We kind of expect that information to just be handed to us in meetings, and it's not going to be. It's not going to happen. You have to make the effort to go out and meet the people that do those jobs, just like you would in any other design thinking scenario. Learn from them, try to understand them, and create a process within your organization that is continuously feeding back to product as you do that.
I hear Maxim likes kombucha, so that's a good place to start.
I love witchcraft.
It's classic startup advice. I mean, I don't know that any of us would give a different answer to that. I mean, if solve a real problem, solve a hard problem, and you only discover that by going and talking to people who are doing the jobs, right? And so that's probably people in your neighborhood. It's not just city officials. Everyone knows someone who's got who touches the city in some way.
Actually, I'll just add to that too. There's also a lot of like community meetings, things like that, where you get to meet people that are actually involved with the community as well as city officials. So there's community planning group meetings. There's coffee with a cop. The police department has a lot of different events. The fire department has a lot of different events. City council meetings. You just got to pick the right ones. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of venues for you to go and do that research.
Anybody else? Yes.
If the space is, the idea of building smart cities is so potentially profitable, why is it none of the big players have come and jumped in, like the Microsofts and the Googles and the Amazons? They have the resources to solve those problems.
I hate to interrupt you. Bill Gates purchased thousands of acres. He's going to build his own smart city in West Phoenix. So,
All right.
keep that in mind.
I'm going to contest the premise of the question. I mean, right now in Toronto, you have Sidewalk Labs owned by Google redeveloping a portion of the waterfront to implement the ideal smart city environment. You have Microsoft out with their City Next platform. You have IBM in the fray. You have Cisco in the fray. They're all going after the space. I think it's too early in the adoption curve for anyone to have really made meaningful traction. I mean, even I think on the GE side, where they've pushed the envelope with their sensor platform, through the current business, there's a lot of debate about where's GE going with that, and can they afford to stay engaged in the same way? And so I think it's just the stage we're at. This is going to take 10, 15 years to shake out, is my assessment.
10, 15? Yeah, possibly.
10, 15.
Just use that. Pass it back to you. Thanks. So use the analogy of the mobile OS platform, which is interesting. So if you did look at that, one of those winners was more proprietary. One of them's more open source based, i.e., iOS, Android. So do you see the Smart City OS kind of going down a similar path as the two battle against each other? 35 options coming down. Maybe what does open source potentially play in the ability to obviously solve this kind of problem?
I'm going to pass this one to Maxim. Aside from saying, I think Google is just closed in the bits you don't see, right? It's not it's open in the bits that serve its commercial interest. But I think what San Diego's done with Linux is super cool. So I'm going over your direction.
So it's an interesting question. It's a question, to be honest, I haven't thought too much about, right? Like as we continue and as it progresses, which platforms are going to win? I do think that the more open platforms will eventually, or at least I want to think that, right? The more open platforms that allow us to build additional things on top of them are the ones that are going to win because of that problem that I discussed a little bit earlier. It is hard to do deep research and understand the workflows of the city staff, right? And a lot of times the best people to define the problems and to fix them are the city staff. And with more flexible platforms comes the ability to be able to define those problems and and outsource the building of them. So I do think in the long term, or at least I want to think that the more open platforms will eventually win.
Maybe a sidebar on that. Either that, or we will get to a point where interoperability will be forced in some manner between the platforms. I think some of the gotchas here, I was talking to a friend in the healthcare space last week, and he was asking about cloud platforms. And we led to very naturally a discussion of Amazon. And the question isn't so much about how hard it is to get stuff into the platform. Have you thought about what happens when you need to get stuff out of the platform on the other side when your needs change? Because that costs quite a bit, right? And so I think you may see cities with, companies with widespread city deployments and real scale, but cities exist over lifespans far longer than any tech company I've ever met. And so at a certain point, I think the confrontation of how data gets out again and how we force interoperability of systems, it's going to have to happen.
All right, guys, I have last questions because we're kind of running out of time. And the question is, we're talking about iPhone, right? And always when you look backwards, things makes perfect sense, right? As been said, you can connect the dots looking backwards, right? And in early 2000, Apple was a failing company. It was a struggling company, right? And when they launched iPod, people thought they were insane. And actually when they launched iPhone, if you guys remember, those who remember, most reviews were like, these people are out of their mind. They don't know how to build phones. They're going to fail. Now, looking back, it's so perfect. It's like the whole strategy that started with iPod and building iTunes Store and the App Store. Everything makes perfect sense. So question to you guys, is there something today that you're seeing that you can say this might be the emergence of smart city operating system? I mean, one thing that comes to my mind is OpenGov, but it's just me.
I'm just going to say the buzzword with no real purpose, blockchain.
Funny thing about the iPhones, does anyone remember the failed music phone that came before the iPhone with AT&T. No, the Rocker, right. And the first iPhone didn't have an app store. It took a year for that to actually happen. So in terms of things I see, I actually do believe, despite every fiber of my being generally trained that standards bodies are hard and miserable to deal with, I'm going to have to choke up 1M, 2M, and some of what's happening in Europe with the EU right now. I think you're seeing various bodies, generally sponsored by EU grants. Certainly there's a lot of activity that I know the British Standards Institute is attached to around urban data marketplaces. I think they're doing some interesting work in the implications for data portability. And then I do believe 1M2M is doing some interesting work in at least making sure we get the network pieces of this to a place where we're not encumbering cities with vendor lock-in at the device level.
So I was kind of like thinking, racking my brain. Huh? A little bit, yeah. But I mean, I did give it some deep thought, and I don't know if the closest thing that I can come up with, and it's a fairly remote thing, is there's a data cataloging tool that we use, and this may be slightly narrow, but you said the beginnings of a city operating system, and then you said OpenGov, which kind of gave me the idea, right? How do you provide access to the swath of city data across different formats and across the different types of things that generated and across the different use cases and what they mean and all that, to a single user to ask an answer and get a question, or ask a question and provide an answer in return? I think this documentation of data that floats around in the enterprise without necessarily being centralized, without necessarily being governed as part of the documentation, I think that would be the beginnings of the city operating system, only because it provides that spider access to the wide slice of the organization. That would probably be the closest thing that I can come up with.
Awesome. David, any other comments?
Blockchain. I have to say that because almost every meeting I have with a venture capitalist is like, what about blockchain? I said, we have the blockchain 5G AI. So just write the check. They're like, wow, cool. I want to go back to this whole thing which you brought up in the beginning, and the book that carries this title. There really are a lot of, and the fact that cities are old things in most cases, except for maybe Vegas. So we know, but hockey. But we know that it's not just the technology and the technological constructs that need to be put in place to create the smart city OS, but clearly a lot of issues with how people interact with it. And the iPhone is a fun example, because when he first held that up on the stage, it was interesting because we all had to learn how to do that. It was not, the early mobile phones were patterned on landline phones. And suddenly we had this wild idea of swiping and things like that, and tapping and touching and pinching. So I think, people, I'm still talking about the iPhone here. Anyway, blockchain. So, but the whole idea of people getting sort of indoctrinated and trained on how to, like, say you're going to streamline the permitting process in the city, but getting the people in the departments to get that that's going to be the new modality seems like that's at least as hard as putting the technology in place.
Awesome. Well, I don't know how about you guys. I feel like we just kind of scratched the surface, and just it started getting interesting, and it's definitely worth a lot more discussion, which we're definitely going to do. We're going to have a lot more events on this topic, and different types of events and workshops and more discussions like this and more roundtable discussion. So please stay tuned. And overall, I just think the opportunity is enormous, as we've seen from and as we've heard, and there's so many different branches you can take it, and there's so many different branches you can explore. We haven't spent much time talking about data privacy, for example, or data security, and many other aspects that you can think of. But I wanted to thank you guys for coming today, for the contribution. Thanks a lot.